So how much do South African fans care about the Champions Cup? This is a question that I posed in the last video I posted on the channel when I was looking back at the last 16 of the competition to just try and get a wider view from fans in South Africa for where the Champions Cup is in terms of the public consciousness, the rugby public consciousness in South Africa at the moment, whether it's something that they enjoy, they appreciate, or something whether they're not too bothered about really. And part of the reason I asked that question was because of the attendance at the Bulls Lyon game in the last 16. On the EPCR website, it had the attendance at about 7,500. I've seen some people say 8, but anyway, not the highest of attendances, in particular when you consider it's in a big 50,000-seater stadium. And it got me thinking more generally, this has been a new competition for the South African sides and for the fans in South Africa. What sort of standing does it have in the country at the moment? So I'm going to go through, I've got a few different responses and a few different interesting talking points to consider when talking about this topic. So I'll go through all of those. Welcome back to the channel, like the video and subscribe to the channel, all that sort of thing. But also comment down below. If you didn't comment or didn't see the last video, then let me know on this one. If you are a South African rugby fan, what do you make of the Champions Cup and the South African side's participation in it? You can have your say in the comment section. Before I get into some of the responses I got, I will say there's no silver bullet for the issues that the Champions Cup is currently facing. The scheduling issues, the travel issues, which I definitely will get onto. It's been a competition that even before actually the South African team's inclusion had been chopping and changing through COVID. It's had different iterations and different formats. It hasn't been a competition that has been anywhere near its best. When you look back to kind of the 2000s, and how it was just the cream of the crop of European rugby. It's been a while since it has been at that level, and there's no simple solution to get it back to that point. I would also say as well that the issues that have arisen around the South African side's inclusion is not purely down to the South African sides. I think EPCR and the organisers need to look at this a lot. Some of the issues with the competition, I think, are down to the general format. I think this year, when you look at the pool stages, what was it? 6 teams in a pool and 4 of them would qualify for the last 16. I think it was just way too many because it took so much jeopardy out of the pool stages. I think they're sticking with that format, by the way, going forward over into next season because they don't want to change it again because, as I say, there has been a lot of change. So I think there could have been more done from other people as well. But let's get into the South African issue. Broadly speaking, a lot of the responses I got was actually pretty positive. And whilst people recognise there are issues, overall they enjoy and appreciate the competition. Just to give you a few examples, love this competition, glad we're out of, I presume that meant to say Super Rugby. I think South Africa will take a few years to get the hang of it, but once we do, we will be great competitors. For now, go Bulls. The Bulls, the last remaining South African team in this year's Champions Cup. As a South African, I love the competition, great format and great teams playing. However, I don't like the South African teams playing in the Champions Cup. So I presume overall here is speaking about the South African teams playing in the URC, I'm guessing, or maybe appreciates the Champions Cup but doesn't want to see them playing in it. Anyway, I would rather let the South African teams focus on the URC and then play, I would rather let South African teams focus on the URC and then play Currie Cup when the other URC teams play the Champions Cup, because at the moment the South African Rugby Union wants to cancel the Currie Cup, and as a South African, the Currie Cup is more important. So this was a really interesting one for me. I wasn't aware of the potential plans for the Currie Cup or exactly what's being planned in South Africa. I know how significant that competition has been historically and over the years to the fans and the clubs in South Africa. And I'll be honest, it just got me thinking, so South African teams are in the URC, and then by extension, they were always then naturally going to be part of the Champions Cup, because you couldn't have it all of a sudden where they couldn't be part of the Champions Cup when all the other teams are qualifying for it from that competition. But yeah, there's no part of me that thinks that is going to happen. I don't know whether the clubs themselves would want that to happen, and I also don't know what the financial implications would be if they were to not play Champions Cup but still play Currie Cup, whether the teams would still be able to make enough money. I know there might be a lot more interest from fans attending games. I don't know what the TV deal would be. There's all sorts of questions that I don't have the answers for, but I thought it was just an interesting solution. It would free up in terms of travel and scheduling issues for the Champions Cup, I don't think it's going to happen or necessarily realistic, but I thought it was an interesting point of view. Just one final one as well. I'm loving it. The competition has quality teams, especially from the last 16, and the game times are perfect. So part of the issue that it seems to me in terms of the South African inclusion in the Champions Cup is a cultural one. And this is kind of in regards to the attendances, what I mentioned at the start of the video, the fact that sometimes the crowds aren't as big as you see for some of those South African rivalries and the games they've been used to watching years after years. And we've got to remember that having switched from Super Rugby, these are new competitions and it will take time. It's only been a few years that the South African teams have been a part of the URC and been a part of the Champions Cup. And naturally, we see attendances and interest fluctuate depending on the opponent and all things like that. Like, it is one of those things that is going to take time. And I think the rivalries will grow over time. That was something that came across in a number of the responses, was the rivalries, particularly with those New Zealand franchises in Super Rugby, were so established. And actually, maybe some of the rivalries with their European counterparts is going to take longer to establish, but they are already getting there as well. You look at some of the results that we've had, whether it be the way Munster won the title last year. I think rivalries are already starting to emerge, but this is just something that is going to take time. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's unrealistic to think that straight away after a couple of years, there's going to be packed out stadiums for all these games. This is what someone else said. So a big problem here in South Africa are the times these games are played at. We're used to rugby at 5 and 7 o'clock in the afternoon, not around midday where most of us are busy, and around the same time when school rugby games are played. I know actually, I'm sure by the time I've got to this point in the video, some of you would have pointed this out. For that Bulls game, there was a really, really big schools game that I think had 25,000 at it at the weekend as well. So that also played a part in the attendance not being as good as it could have been. I myself really enjoyed the Champions Cup, but I do think South Africans are not yet used to this competition. Also, another small factor, the sun is scorching hot here in Pretoria. Yeah, I did see that at altitude, absolutely baking, middle of the afternoon. Maybe a lot of people would rather have stayed at home. But I think it's just, again, that kind of just goes into some of the cultural things I say, in terms of if the game's a bit kicking off at different times, there are things here that people have to get used to. Also, so this is a longer one, but I thought it was quite interesting. As a South African, I can only speak for myself. Apart from the biggest gripe I hear from others is that it's difficult to keep track of what competition is on at any given stage. This is a welcome to Northern Hemisphere rugby, I'll be honest with you. We aren't used to the breaks we see over December and Six Nations, and with the Champions Cup on now, then URC, then back and forth. But I blame the South African media for not communicating the scheduling very well to some degree, and just the general public needing to get used to the Northern Hemisphere schedule for the rest. I think that is such a good point, and you're not alone in this, by the way. The schedule is an issue even for us in the Northern Hemisphere over years, and it's part of the issue of playing multiple competitions, in that you will play a chunk of Premiership or URC, then you will break for a couple of rounds of the Champions Cup, then you're back to the other competition, then back to the Champions Cup. You then have a break when the Six Nations is on, then you're jumping between competitions again. It is a huge issue, and again, I don't really know what the solution is, other than to get rid of the Champions Cup altogether, which the teams aren't going to do, partly because of the history of it, and partly because of the money they get from hosting games, the extra TV revenue they get. So you're not wrong. I think that's a really, really good point, but I'm not entirely sure what can be done about it at the moment. Travel will, of course, always be tricky for any tournament we participate in, given basically the geography. Apart from that, the pros are, for me, are more substantial than the cons in terms of the timing of matches being more favourable. The travelling north-south is more favourable than going east-west. Again, get that in terms of the time difference. And then pure rugby quality, seeing our sides getting into a position to retain and lure more of our own best players. Though to a large degree, that's down to Northern Hemisphere sides tightening the budgets as well. And then just that final point that I mentioned, the rivalries are growing. As a Stormers supporter, I particularly want to get one over Ulster and Munster just as much as the Sharks. La Rochelle also moving up the love-to-hate list. Yeah, they've had a few good games with them, though it would take something special to depose the Bulls off the top. So it is growing. I thought that was a really good message. The travel is obviously something that gets spoken about a huge amount when you speak about these issues. And I feel like there was probably even more travel issues with Super Rugby, was there not? Again, just going into that last message in terms of the time difference, how far that would have been a lot of the time. But can more be done, essentially? Like, what can we possibly do for the travel issues? Because the continents or the countries are not moving any closer together. This was one suggestion that was in the comments on that last video. The travel problems that South African teams are facing is an issue, and I feel the limits placed on what flights are allowed to get is just silly, and some might say it's even done so intentionally to hamper South African teams. A solution: South African Rugby should buy/allocate a rugby or rugby private planes for these type of travel situations, even if it's just for the big games like playoff matches that are overseas. That way, short-term notice flights are much easier to arrange, and it's a direct flight. So many of you will be aware, I think the Bulls have this issue this week of getting themselves from South Africa up to the Northern Hemisphere. The Stormers had it last year ahead of their quarter-final with Exeter, where they have to fly, I think, to the Middle East. Is it Doha? The team's taking multiple flights, so they're not all arriving at the same time. They get into Europe midway through the week. They're barely able to train. It's just terrible preparation for what is supposed to be one of the biggest games of the season. And it undermines the competition as well. I think that message touches upon some good points for me. Can South African Rugby Union do more? Can EPCR do more? Do we need to have some sort of pot that allows for direct private flights between the countries to help out the teams? Because the travel is probably, I would argue, the biggest issue at the moment in terms of the teams, because it has the potential to undermine the competition and the competitiveness of the competitions. Like, I think the Bulls will be hard-pressed to win this weekend, and that's nothing to do with the quality in their team. They are packed full of it. It is to do with the logistics of actually getting, with a short turnaround, up to the Northern Hemisphere to play a game. So surely that is something that needs to be done. So just finally, my concluding thoughts on this is it will grow. I think, yes, the South African fans, from what I can gather, do care. I think it is new and it will take time to grow, for people to appreciate it, for the rivalries to grow, all that sort of stuff. Time will do that. And the other big thing that I was thinking about or pondering when I was going to do this video is it's not going to change. The South African teams are now part of the Northern Hemisphere scheduling. That is going to stay the way for the foreseeable future. That's not going to change. So how can they work it so that it works best for everyone? In particular, the travel, as I say, it's so important that they get that right, but I think it's so important that we get the scheduling right. And this is maybe a different can of worms and a different conversation, a different video for another day. But what I spoke about earlier, the URC into Champions Cup, back to URC, back to Champions Cup, into Six Nations, back to those other different competitions, that is a major, major issue. It's been a major issue, I think, in the Northern Hemisphere for a long, long time. That is a bigger issue that they possibly need to fix. And that's when I would start to question where the Champions Cup fits in and whether you can cut games in terms of player welfare, in terms of the scheduling and what's easy to understand as well. But I'll leave that there. The other thing as well, that other message that I mentioned, should they just forget about the Champions Cup and focus on the URC? I'm not sure that's going to happen, but it is food for thought. Hopefully that has been useful. It's just a few thoughts, canvassing a few different opinions for how much South African fans care about the Champions Cup at the moment. There are clearly issues with the competition, but I think there is also clearly an appreciation of the Champions Cup and the sort of quality of teams that they're coming up against in it as well. So drop a comment down below, like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.